When Lila graduated college, she decided to take a year off to work on her art and escape the hectic pace of city life. She found a small, isolated cabin nestled deep in the woods, a perfect place for inspiration. It was simple, a little run down, but it was all she could afford on her tight budget. The landlord was an elderly man who seemed eager to rent it out, giving her the keys with a smile that lingered a little too long. "It's peaceful out here," he'd said, his voice almost too soft. "But don't be surprised if the woods get a bit restless at night." Lila didn't think much of it. She was ready to embrace solitude, to paint and draw, surrounded by nature's beauty. For the first week, everything was perfect. The tall trees swayed gently in the wind, and the only sounds at night were the rustling leaves and occasional owl hoots. But then the strangeness began. Small things at first. Lila would wake up to find her sketchbook scattered across the floor, or her brushes dipped in water she hadn't set out. She chalked it up to sleepwalking or just forgetting, but the oddities grew more disturbing. Heavy furniture shifted overnight. One morning she found all the windows wide open, the frigid morning air biting at her skin. That was when the dread set in, like she was being watched. One evening, Lila stayed up late, determined to finish a piece she'd been working on. The cabin's lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for a flashlight and turned it on, but as soon as the beam swept across the room, it sputtered and died. There was a flash of bright light from the hallway, blinding her momentarily. She gasped, dropping the dead flashlight, but by the time she blinked the spots from her vision, everything was pitch black again. Heart pounding, she tried to calm herself. Just a power surge, she thought, but then she heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from the shadows. It resonated through the cabin, rattling her bones. She didn't dare move. The silence stretched out, tense and suffocating. Then came a voice, deep, guttural, and unearthly. "Leave, now." Lila's skin prickled. She glanced around, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Leave." The word echoed again, clearer this time, reverberating through the dark. Then the light flashed again, illuminating the entire room for a split second. She caught a glimpse of something hunched in the corner, something dark, with glowing eyes and twisted limbs. With a strangled cry, Lila scrambled out of the room, knocking over canvases and jars of paint in her haste. She burst through the front door and stumbled into the yard, gasping for air. She turned back, expecting to see a figure at the window or in the doorway, but the cabin was silent, empty. She didn't go back inside that night. Instead, she drove to a nearby inn and checked in, her mind racing. The next morning, she returned with a local handyman, determined to see what could have made that voice or caused those flashes of light. They searched the entire cabin, but found no signs of intruders, no footprints, no evidence of any living thing. As she stood outside, staring at the small, weathered building, the old landlord drove up. He stepped out of his car, his expression grim. "I figured you'd be back," he said quietly. "You're not the first one to leave in a hurry." "What is this place?" Lila demanded, her voice trembling. "Who or what is in there?" The landlord sighed, his gaze shifting to the empty cabin. "My sister used to live here," he said softly. "She was an artist like you, but she didn't want to leave. Even after she passed, something kept her here, refusing to let go." Lila's breath hitched. She's still here?" He nodded slowly. "Some say it's her spirit. Others say it's something darker. Whatever it is, it doesn't want company." That evening, Lila packed her things and left for good, never looking back. Months later, the cabin was condemned and torn down. It's now just an overgrown patch of land, choked with weeds and scattered with wildflowers. No one dares build there anymore. Lila sometimes drives by the empty lot, curious. The feeling of eyes on her never quite goes away. Some nights, as she stares at the dark patch of forest where the cabin used to stand, she thinks she can see it, the flicker of a light in the woods, like a lantern, striking in the distance. Then she remembers the voice. "Leave." In the old part of town, there's a narrow alleyway no one talks about. It's not marked on any map, and you could pass it 100 times without noticing it. But once you do, you'll never forget. The locals call it the breathing alley. They say it's alive. It's a claustrophobic passage between two decaying buildings, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The walls are covered in grime and strange markings, symbols no one can quite place. But it's the air inside that makes it infamous. No one knows how long the alley's been there. Older residents claim it's always been part of the town, but they remember stories passed down from their grandparents. Tales of people disappearing without a trace. All of them had one thing in common. They were last seen near that alley. It wasn't until Jacob Bennett went missing that people began to truly fear it. Jacob was a delivery driver, new to the town. He didn't know the stories and had no reason to avoid the alley. One rainy evening, while making his rounds, his van broke down just a block away. Frustrated, he decided to take a shortcut through the old streets on foot. That's when he found the alley. A faint sound came from within. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was a slow, steady noise, like breathing, deep, almost rhythmic. Curious and thinking someone might be in trouble, Jacob stepped into the alley. He didn't come out. The next day, his van was found parked where he had left it, but there was no trace of Jacob. The alley looked the same as ever, dark, narrow, and still. A search party combed through the surrounding streets, but it was as if he had simply vanished. The only thing they found was his cell phone, lying on the wet ground just inside the entrance. Weeks passed and the town began to move on, though people whispered about the alley with new intensity. Some swore they could hear a faint sighing sound when they passed by it, like something slumbering just out of sight. Then, one cold autumn night, a young woman named Emily, who lived nearby, woke to a strange noise. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder. The unmistakable sound of breathing, like someone standing just outside her window. Terrified, she peered outside but saw nothing. But the sound persisted, growing deeper, more labored. She knew where it was coming from, the alley. The next morning, despite her fear, she had to know. She crept toward the alley's entrance, trembling as she approached. The air around her grew colder with each step, and the sound of breathing became clearer. She peered inside but saw only shadows and the slick, wet cobblestones. The alley seemed to pulse, as if alive, its breath matching her own. But something was different this time. Lying in the center of the alley was Jacob's jacket, crumpled and stained with mud. Her heart raced as she stepped closer, reaching for the fabric. That's when the shadows moved. At first, she thought it was her eyes playing tricks on her, but then she saw them. Figures, half-formed, emerging from the walls. Their faces were twisted, barely human, their eyes hollow and filled with hunger. Emily froze in horror as one of the figures reached out, its hand brushing her arm with a cold that burned. She stumbled backward, her scream lodged in her throat, and ran without looking back. She didn't stop until she was safely inside her house. She slammed the door shut, trembling, but deep down, she knew it wasn't over. The next morning, the alley was silent again. People came and went, and the sun shone weakly on its cracked pavement. But Emily knew what she had seen, and soon enough, others began to whisper about it too. Now no one goes near the alley after dark, and if you listen closely at night, you can hear the faint echo of Jacob's final gasp, mingled with the sighs of those who came before him. The alley is always waiting, hungry for those who dare to disturb its restless slumber. And once it breathes you in, it never breathes you out. Thanks for diving into the shadows with us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the truth is scarier than fiction. Until next time, sleep tight if you can.